The main job of the lungs is gas exchange, pulling oxygen into the body and getting rid of carbon dioxide. Normally, during an inhale, the diaphragm contracts to pull downward, and the chest muscles contract to pull open the chest, which both help suck in air like a vacuum. And then during an exhale, the muscles relax, allowing the lungs to spring back to their normal size, which pushes air out. When you breathe in, air flows through the nostrils and enters the nasal cavity, which is lined by cells that release mucus. That mucus is salty, sticky, and has lysozymes, which are enzymes that help kill bacteria. Nose hairs at the entrance of the nasal cavity get coated with that mucus and are able to trap large particles of dust and pollen as well as bacteria, forming tiny clumps of boogers. The nasal cavity is connected to 4 sinuses, which are air-filled spaces inside the bones that surround the nose, called the paranasal sinuses. There's the frontal, ethmoid, sphenoid, and maxillary sinus. Those sinuses help the inspired air to circulate for a bit so it has time to get warm and moist. They also act like tiny echo chambers that help amplify the sound of your voice. And this is why you sound so different when you plug your nose, or if they get clogged with mucus during a cold. So that relatively clean, warm, and moist air goes from the nasal cavity into the pharynx, or throat. The region connecting the two is called the nasopharynx, and the part connecting the pharynx to the oral cavity is called the oropharynx. The soft palate, which is the softer portion of the roof of your mouth behind the hard palate, which is the part you can feel with your tongue, and the pendulum-like uvula hanging at its end move together to form a flap or valve that closes the nasopharynx off when you eat to prevent food from going up into the nasopharynx. Finally, there's the laryngopharynx, the part of the pharynx that's continuous with the larynx, or the voice box. Up to this point, food and air share a common path, but at the top of the larynx, it's a spoon-shaped flap of cartilage called the epiglottis, which acts like a lid that seals off the airway when you're eating, so that food can only go one way, down the esophagus and towards the stomach. If anything other than air gets into the larynx, then you have a cough reflex that kicks it right back out. Now, once air makes its way into the larynx, it then continues down the trachea, or windpipe, which splits into 2 main stem bronchi. The point at which they split is called the carina. It then enters the lungs, and the right lung has 3 lobes, the upper lobe, middle lobe, and lower lobe. The left lung just has 2 lobes, the upper lobe and the lower lobe. The right mainstem bronchus is wider and more vertical than the left, which is why if you accidentally inhale something big that can't get coughed up, like a peanut, it's more likely to go into the right lung than the left. The mainstem bronchi then divide into smaller and smaller bronchi. The trachea and the first 3 generations of bronchi are all pretty wide and use cartilage rings for support. After the first 3 generations of bronchi, though, the airways get more narrow, called bronchioles, meaning little bronchi, and these can stay open without the need for cartilage. The last part of the conducting bronchioles are the terminal bronchioles, and then after that, air gets to the respiratory bronchioles, which are unique because they have tiny outpouchings that bud off from their walls. These outpouchings are called alveoli, and there are about 500 million of them in the lungs. Eventually, the respiratory bronchioles end when there's nothing but alveoli. And at that point, the airway is called an alveolar duct, rather than a respiratory bronchiole. And this is the final destination of the inhaled air. The alveolar wall has a completely different structure than the bronchioles. There are no cilia or smooth muscle, and instead the wall is lined by thin epithelial cells called pneumocytes. Alright, as a quick recap. The respiratory system facilitates gas exchange. Oxygen in the air is inhaled and makes its way through the pharynx, larynx, trachea, large upper airways, conducting bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, the alveoli, and finally the capillary to be sent to the body's tissue. Then carbon dioxide makes the reverse journey to eventually be exhaled into the world.